Imagine finding a hidden tunnel in your new house, only to discover it's linked to a chilling conspiracy. Stay to the very end to find out how this house became a haunted nightmare. And mind it, this is based on a true story. Today's story is The Watcher. Keep watching closely. Will make your head spin like never before. Meet the Branuc family. They were on their way to check out a new house they were thinking of buying. The peaceful, green neighborhood with beautiful homes made Nora feel completely at ease. Nora's husband, Dean, and their two kids, Ellie and Carter, were just as excited to see the place. After a short drive, they arrived. The house was so grand that they instantly fell in love with it. But as they admired the house, something unsettling happened. From a distance, they noticed a stranger staring directly at Carter. Dean tried to brush it off, joking that maybe it was just some competitor eyeing the house, but assured his family they'd beat everyone to it and make it theirs. As soon as they entered the house, they heard strange noises, like someone groaning. It turned out to be a woman named Pearl Winslow, who was already inside along with her brother, Jasper, who likes to stay in the dumbwaiter. She introduced herself as the president of the local preservation society. She pointed to an old dumbwaiter in the house and proudly called it a national treasure, for which she has already conducted 14 meetings. Then she abruptly left. Family couldn't help but be puzzled. How could a dumbwaiter be considered a national treasure? After all, a dumbwaiter was just a small elevator used to carry food from one floor to another. So why was Pearl making such a big deal out of it? As they pondered this, Nora continued touring the house and unexpectedly ran into her old college friend, Karen, who was handling the sale of the house. It was quite the coincidence. They bumped into each other after so many years. Karen hadn't expected that Nora, now a famous artist with her work featured in the papers, would have such success. Karen herself hadn't been as lucky and was now in the business of buying and selling homes. After her divorce, she had been single and was still on the lookout for a sugar daddy, so she wouldn't have to work too hard. The Branuc family really loved the house, but they weren't the only ones interested in buying it. There were 3 other buyers, and whoever bid the highest would get the house. Determined, Dean cashed out all his savings, stocks, and bonds to put down a big down payment so they wouldn't need to take a huge loan. 6 weeks later, we see Dean returning home from work, unaware that someone was watching him from a distance. The neighbors, too, always had their eyes on the house and couldn't hide their envy when they saw the grand piano being unloaded into the home, something Ellie had asked her dad to buy for her. Meanwhile, Carter had asked for ferrets as his contribution to the new house, as each family member had their own quirky desires. Everything seemed to be going well for the family. Dean's career was thriving, and they were settling into their new home. But just when they started planning renovations for the kitchen and basement, things began to take a strange turn. Ellie started hearing mysterious, soothing piano sounds inside the house. But when she checked, no one was there, and the piano was silent. She immediately told her mom, but Nora brushed it off as nothing serious. However, Dean did notice something strange. Ellie had lipstick on. Neither of her parents allowed her to buy or wear lipstick, so where did she get it from? Dean was also very strict about how she dressed, always keeping a close eye on her appearance and if she's wearing any revealing clothes. He had firm rules due to which she had no boyfriends, and hardly any friends for that matter. But what Dean didn't realize was that sometimes too many restrictions can backfire. Very next day, the family received a letter in their mailbox. It was typed, and it said something like this: "Welcome to 657 Boulevard. Let me take this opportunity to welcome you as my new neighbors. This house has been the focus of my family for decades, and now it's my responsibility to watch over it. People have been keeping an eye on this house since 1920. Now, it's my turn. You know what's buried within these walls? You don't know the history of this house. I'm not sure what brought your family here, but I can already see contractors swarming the place. Why haven't you touched the basement? There's something there you don't understand. Leave it alone, or you'll regret it soon enough. I've seen your 2 cute little kids. For their sake, I suggest you pack up and leave this house. Youngblood, every day hundreds of people pass by your house, and I am one of them. The writer, the watcher." Mr. and Mrs. Branuc immediately rushed to the police station to file a complaint and met with Senior Detective Rock Chamberlain to explain their predicament. After investigating, Chamberlain felt it might be a prank. There hadn't been any complaints from the neighborhood, although many years ago, 2 children had disappeared, but it was so long ago that it barely mattered now. However, there was a man named Jasper who lived nearby, and he had a habit of sneaking into people's homes. Just that morning, he had entered their home, which scared Dean when he suddenly saw him. Jasper was known for sneaking in, eating food from the fridge, and other petty actions, so they suspected he might have written the letter. Concerned about Dean's children's safety, Chamberlain decided to send the letter for DNA testing, using the saliva on it to try and identify the culprit. However, he warned them that the process would take about a month. After returning from the police station, another strange incident happened. Carter was playing with his ferret in the dumbwaiter, but as he opened the door, Jasper startled him. No one knew how Jasper had even gotten inside, as all doors and windows were locked. Dean dragged Jasper out and warned his sister Pearl that if Jasper showed up in their house again, Dean would knock him out. Instead of apologizing, Pearl explained that the previous owners let Jasper play in the dumbwaiter, but Dean angrily responded that he would have the dumbwaiter removed. Pearl started to threaten them as if the house belonged to her, saying the trees were over 100 years old and they spoke to her. She rambled on like a lunatic, but since Dean owned the property, he didn't care. He even considered chopping down the whole forest if necessary. Pearl warned him that neither the dumbwaiter nor the trees would be removed, and she threatened to take the matter to the Preservation Society, saying she would be watching them. Not even an hour later, another woman hopped on their boundary fence and entered the property. Dean was furious. How were all these people getting into his property without his permission? This woman, Maureen, lived with her husband Mitch behind their house and claimed she was there to pick flowers she had planted 20 years ago. Dean warned her to only pick flowers from her side, but she got angry, insisting that she had planted the flowers. When Dean gently asked how she got inside, Maureen explained that the boundary near the bushes was broken. Dean warned her not to come into his property without permission again, but Maureen left, threatening that we would be watching you. Dean started to wonder if he had made a mistake buying this house. The next day, despite their tight budget, they called a technician named iShowSpeed to install alarms and cameras all around the house. Dean had to leave for work, so he told iShowSpeed to finalize the camera placement. Later, iShowSpeed was distracted by Ellie, who was swimming, and instead of working, he started chatting with her. Ellie gave him a sweet smile and walked away. At night, a strange woman was keeping an eye on their house. Then, while everyone was sleeping, the ferret came out of the cage, and someone strangled the ferret to death. Carter saw his dead ferret in the morning, and the tension set in the house. They even called the police, who suspected that the ferret might have hit his head on the wall and died, as there were no signs of trespassing in the house. Dean was super angry, and even Ellie was troubling him now. He started to suspect that something was going on between them since Ellie's behavior and wardrobe had changed ever since iShowSpeed started coming around. Meanwhile, Mitch and Maureen were cursing about the cameras being installed. It was odd. Why were they so bothered by someone else's house having cameras? That night, Karen also showed up, staring at their house briefly before leaving. It seemed like everyone in the neighborhood was fixated on their house. The next morning, as the newspaper arrived, Dean also checked the mailbox. There were a few letters, and among them was another letter from the Watcher. It read, "I am the Watcher. Have you uncovered the mystery of this house? I have been watching it for the past 20 years. 3 families have lived here and, upon my advice, sold the house and left. But you are special. Your daughter plays the piano well. Where is she? Sleeping? Does she go to the basement often? If so, that would make my job easier." Dean thought that staying here without cameras installed was risky. Plus, the house renovations were going to last a week. With all the dust flying around, Carter, who had asthma, would suffer. So, Dean and his wife decided to stay in a motel nearby until things settled. They booked a room at a motel close by, and after dropping off Nora and the kids, Dean returned home since he needed to open the door for the workers in the morning. Just as he dozed off, the doorbell rang, but no one was there. Whoever it was had been watching Dean from a distance. Entering the house, he heard piano music playing. Heading toward the sound, he discovered that it was coming from the Bluetooth alarm system. Then, someone ran past him, but he couldn't see who it was. On the other hand, Nora was also dealing with strange happenings. Someone had been calling her and breathing heavily into the phone. The Branuc family's peace was long gone. The question lingered. How could anyone know they were staying in room 5 at the motel? When they asked the motel receptionist, she said that someone had called and requested the call to be transferred to that room. Frustrated, Dean hired a private detective named Theodora Birch. Birch got to work gathering all the details and began searching for the Watcher. Meanwhile, Nora confided in her friend Karen, sharing everything that had been happening. Karen, curiously, asked about the first letter they'd received. "What was your first thought after reading it?" she inquired. Nora admitted that her first thought was to sell the house, and that's exactly what Karen wanted to hear. She immediately offered to be their broker, promising to sell the house within a week, but only if they reduced the price by $500,000, meaning they'd lose a lot. And who would benefit from this deal? Karen herself, of course. Could Karen be the Watcher, trying to scare them for her gain? Ellie, on the other hand, needed to understand that his parents were already stressed and that she shouldn't make things worse. But would Ellie listen? No way. The next morning, Dean met with his private investigator, Birch, who had dug up information on the previous owner of the house and arranged a meeting. Former owner's name was Andrew. Andrew was eager to help Dean because when he faced trouble with the house, no one helped him either. Back in 2014, the property market had crashed and house prices plummeted. Andrew and his wife, Rose, were over the moon when they snagged this mansion for a steal. Andrew, a talent agent, soon landed major clients who were billionaires, but the money started flowing in. Life was good for Andrew, Rose, and their 3-year-old son, Caleb. But then, things took a turn for the worse. Their strange neighbors, Mitch and Maureen, who lived behind them, began visiting frequently. Andrew was out most of the day, so Rose spent more time with them. Soon, Rose became distant and irritable. She started hearing music at night and seeing mysterious things. They called the cops almost every other day, but nothing came of it. Tensions in the house grew, and Andrew couldn't focus on his work. This eventually led to his clients dropping him. Their situation worsened, and one night, Caleb told them about going to Maureen's house. He saw a group of people in red robes standing in a circle, with a baby on the table in the center, drinking its blood. Andrew brushed it off, thinking his 3-year-old son had just imagined it. But the next day, the news reported a 3-month-old baby missing in their neighborhood. Andrew's world turned upside down. He spiraled into depression and tried distancing himself from Mitch and Maureen. He even went to the police, but nothing came of it. Then, the letters started. Threatening letters from the Watcher, asking if he would sacrifice his wife or his child. The number of letters grew, and they were eerily similar to the ones Dean had been receiving. One day, it all came to a head. Caleb accidentally cut his finger, and when Rose went to get bandages, she returned to find Maureen sucking the blood from his wound. They were terrified, as the house had been locked up. Maureen must have used a secret tunnel or something to sneak in. That very night, they packed their bags and fled the city, renting a small house. But Rose never recovered from the trauma and sank deeper into depression. Then, the unthinkable happened. Rose took her own life. Andrew warned Dean that the house was cursed and that he should leave as soon as possible. Dean was at a loss for what to do next. The next morning, at precisely 7 a.m., construction began on the house. Pearl immediately called in an emergency complaint, claiming they were destroying everything. Maureen showed up, ready to pick a fight. She was dead set against any changes being made to the house. The sound of drills and hammers drove her mad. Dean firmly told her that it was his house and that he would do whatever he wanted. As for the noise, it was within the society's rules. They were allowed to make noise from 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. "I'll keep an eye on you." Maureen stormed off with a threat of her own. Later, when Dean arrived at the office, he learned that the partnership he had been eyeing had been given to a new guy, someone who had been there for only 4 years. Relying on this partnership, Dean had bought a house worth $3 million. He was now anxious about how he'd managed to pay the mortgage. Instead of visiting his family, he just checked in over the phone, and went to sleep. In the middle of the night, we see a watcher keeping an eye on Dean's house. Suddenly, 2 gunshots rang out, jolting Dean awake. By morning, it was revealed that Mitch and Maureen had shot themselves. Their son was furious because their last letter mentioned a fight with Dean. He blamed Dean. What could Dean have done? He was just minding his own business, and it was Maureen who had come to pick a fight. After dinner, Nora took the kids to a motel, and Dean also went to bed. But the stress kept him awake. Suddenly, the security alarm went off. He started searching for the intruder in the house and glanced outside the window to see Jasper standing on the road. But until the cameras were installed outside, they had to tolerate this disturbance. The next morning, Detective Birch arrived at the police station to gather information on Dean's case. Chamberlain handed over all the documents related to house number 657, hoping they'd be helpful. Birch started going through the files. Meanwhile, Nora, like every day, went to play tennis with her friend Karen. Seizing the opportunity, Karen asked her about the letters. Nora told her that, for now, the letters had stopped coming and maybe someone was just playing a prank on them. But Karen wasn't convinced, arguing that this was no joke. Karen feared that the person might come after them at the motel and suggested they sell the house. She even took Nora to see another house priced at just $2 million, saving them some money. Karen, however, was only thinking about her own benefit, scaring Nora to make her sell the house more easily. Meanwhile, Dean came home looking for Nora, who had just returned from the motel with the kids. Ellie had locked herself in her room, which made her father furious because they'd previously talked about never locking the door. Ellie said her mom had gone to play tennis, but even after all the warnings, she slammed the door shut and locked it because Speed was with her. Dean went to the kitchen for a snack and was shocked to find a stranger already making a sandwich. Confused, Dean asked who he was and why he was in his house. The man introduced himself as John, a building inspector, explaining that he was there to check on their construction, and Nora had permitted him to eat anything from the fridge. During their conversation, John mentioned seeing his daughter with a young African-American guy who installed the security camera. John also shared how he had struggled with his own daughter who had gone astray. He warned Dean to be cautious, as he didn't want Dean to go through what he did. Initially, Dean was angry hearing this, but then asked how John had managed to control his daughter. John said he used to pray at the Lutheran church nearby, and eventually, things worked out. After John left, Dean hurried to his contractor, telling him that the building inspector had been extremely rude, entering their house and snooping around, even eating in their kitchen. The contractor was shocked because there were only 2 building inspectors in Westfield, neither of whom was named John. They usually only come to inspect the site after construction is finished. This meant the man who had entered Dean's home had fooled him. That evening, Dean witnessed something even more bizarre. Mitch and Maureen were walking down the street with bags in hand. But how? They had shot themselves, and their bodies had been recovered. What was going on? Would Dean and Nora eventually be driven out of the house by all these strange events? Who was this watcher tormenting them? Were they part of a cult that really drank children's blood? Would Dean's daughter fall further out of control? And who was John, the man who was at the house the first time they visited, staring at them intensely? Could he be the watcher? Or was Pearl behind it all, trying to scare them into leaving so her crazy brother Jasper could play in the dumbwaiter? Or maybe it was Karen, trying to scare them into selling the house cheaply so she could flip it, profit. Keep watching, because huge secrets are about to unfold. After a thorough investigation, Birch uncovered a secret that wasn't mentioned anywhere in the media or newspapers. It turns out that house number 657, which currently belongs to Dean, was owned by the Graff family until 1995. Within the Graff family, there was a guy named John, who retired from the army and started working as an accountant. He bought a nice apartment in the city, and only cared about 2 things: his family and the church. John was a super religious guy, and he'd go to church every Sunday. One evening, while returning from work, he was late and couldn't find a taxi, so he decided to walk. Suddenly, a thug attacked him from behind and stole his money. His mother, who was very wealthy from inherited money and property, couldn't bear to see him like this. Since their place wasn't good for raising a family, she bought him a house in Westfield, the same house where Dean now lives. John had a good family. His son Dean, his daughter Pat, who had become a lost cause, his beautiful wife Helen, and his mother all lived there. Being a devout man, John would make everyone pray before meals. His wife, however, would mock the prayer. She was incredibly rude, and this made John furious inside. He already felt like he'd lost control of his daughter, and now his wife was just as bad. These issues distracted him from work, and one day, his boss fired him. That day, he cried a lot because his mom always taunted him, saying he'd been an accountant for 12 years and should have been department head by now. How could he tell her that not only was he not the head, but he had also lost his job? To hide his failure, he started lying to everyone, pretending to go to work every day. Would go to the bank and withdraw small amounts from his mom's account, which he managed, though there was no risk of getting caught. He used that stolen money to support the household, and no one knew he wasn't actually working. This went on for a while, but eventually, trouble came knocking. Someone started sending him letters under the name The Watcher, detailing everything about his life, including who his wife was with when he wasn't around, and his daughter's affairs. Watcher knew it all. One day, John saw his daughter's misbehavior with his own eyes. She was partying with her teacher. Sitting alone, he started contemplating what the endgame of all this madness was. Stress was eating him alive. His rage was bubbling over, and this time, he lost the battle with himself. Dinner, he told his entire family that they were all going to die. Next day, he asked his kids' principal for a week off for them. Then he started cutting his face out of every family photo. Once his plan was set, he first shot his unfaithful wife. His mom, hearing the gunshot, came out, and he killed her too. Later, his daughter returned from her outing, and he shot her as well. Then, cool as a cucumber, he sat down and made himself a sandwich like nothing had happened. That evening, when his son came home after playing, he killed him too, wiping out his entire family. Next day, killed the teacher as well. The week passed, and no one knew what had happened. One day, when the police entered the house, they found the bodies shriveled up like mummies, as if all their blood had been drained. They found bottles of milk in the basement. They were filled with blood. All of them were empty. Hearing this, Dean lost his mind. Why had no one told him about this? Clearly, something like this would lower the property value. which is probably why the locals kept it quiet. And the Chamberlains? They moved to Westfield in 2005, so they likely didn't know about it either. But what happened to John Graff? After that day, John disappeared and no one saw him again. Then it hit Dean, the building inspector who had come to his house that day. Wasn't his name John too? That had been John Graff? And which church did he go to? Dean asked if he used to go to St. Mark's Westfield Lutheran Church. Dean quickly realized that the man who entered his house as a building inspector might be John Graff. To verify the truth of this, Dean immediately went to Pearl Willow's house, but they refused to say anything. Meanwhile, Nora returned home with the kids. The camera installation work was complete, and only a bit of work in the basement was left. It wasn't bothering them. That night, the watcher was still keeping a close eye on their house. On the other side, Ellie had her own situation going on with iShowSpeed. She was sending him personal photos. The next morning, Nora had to go to art gallery, so Dean went to drop the kids off at school before heading to work. After they left, Nora checked the mailbox. There were 2 letters, one of which was from the watcher. It said, "You've installed cameras everywhere, but you still won't escape my gaze." Frightened, Nora called Dean, and the next moment, they met with their private detective, Birch. During this time, Birch had gathered some crucial information. She suspected that the guy who installed the camera might also be the watcher, as he was always lurking around their house. To dig deeper, Birch assigned one of her men to follow him. It turned out iShowSpeed was a gamer, and his in-game name was the Watcher. This couldn't be just a coincidence, but there was no solid proof. The couple had moved away from the city's chaos to find peace. Everything was going against them. In an attempt to save money, they had hired iShowSpeed to install cameras, which had now turned into a nightmare. It seemed that Ellie was also under his influence. To uncover the truth, Nora decided to check Ellie's phone since she knew the password. That evening, during dinner, Dean found an excuse to check her phone and discovered everything about her interaction with iShowSpeed and the personal picture. When confronted, Ellie lashed out at her dad, saying, "Leave me alone." An enraged Dean set a new rule. From now on, Ellie would stay in her room after school without any phone. The next morning, iShowSpeed showed up outside their house in his car because Ellie hadn't been responding to his messages. The moment Dean saw him, he lunged at him. Ellie immediately called the police. Dean tried to get iShowSpeed to admit that he was the one sending the threatening letters under the name The Watcher, knowing his in-game name. Just then, the police arrived. Dean explained to the officers that this boy was sending inappropriate photos to his 16-year-old daughter, threatening letters to their family. However, according to local law, the age of consent was 16, so neither of them was committing any crime. The officer warned Dean that if he laid a hand on iShowSpeed again, he could face charges himself. As for the threatening letters, the police summoned both of them and began questioning iShowSpeed's mom, asking if her son was sending letters to Dean's house to intimidate them. iShowSpeed denied everything. It turned out iShowSpeed's mom had named him after a watchman, as he used to work as one. To prove his innocence, iShowSpeed even provided a DNA sample to be matched against the DNA from the letters. While they were busy at the police station, Ellie left her room and used Carter's iPad to record a video. A few hours later, Dean's assistant found this video on YouTube Shorts and immediately recognized Ellie. In the video, Ellie openly said that she was in love with an African-American boy, and when her dad found out, he locked her in her room and took her phone away. That's why she was recording the video from her brother's iPad, asking viewers to share it as much as possible to get her justice. Until now, you must have realized that similar things had happened in this house before. Ellie had no idea of the disaster she had just unleashed. The video caused Nora's country club membership to be canceled, and Dean was on the verge of losing his job. Nora finally realized the gravity of the situation. People began to see them as racists, and their reputation in society took a nosedive. After meeting Karen, Nora returned home and checked the mailbox again. This time, there was an envelope with the words, "Watch me," written on it. Dean's boss also received a similar letter with a video of Dean sleeping soundly in his bedroom. A girl entered the bedroom and began undressing. But there were no cameras in Dean's bedroom, so this video had to be fake. Dean informed his boss, who then noticed that the nightgown the girl was wearing resembled one worn by John Graff's daughter, who had died in 1995. Nothing made sense anymore. Was iShowSpeed plotting revenge on them? During break time, iShowSpeed was hanging around outside his company. He smugly revealed that he had sent the video to Dean's boss to get back at him. So, it was iShowSpeed's doing all along. He even admitted to installing the camera in their bedroom. But everything else was on them. Ever since iShowSpeed came to install the cameras, Dean had been paranoid about the Watcher. iShowSpeed also tried to find out who the Watcher was, but found nothing. Eventually, he suspected that Dean might be sending the letters himself, possibly trying to scare his wife into selling the house due to their financial troubles. But he saw something completely different. If that girl wasn't sent by IShowSpeed, then how did she even get into the house? This thought kept gnawing Dean. When he reached home, Nora was already waiting, all set. She had never imagined that in her absence, Dean would stoop so low. Dean tried to convince her by explaining the story of John Graff, assuring her that someone was setting him up. John Graff's daughter, who had passed away, wore the same nightgown as the girl in the video footage. But Nora didn't listen. All she wanted now was a divorce. Not only that, but she also kicked Dean out of the house. No matter what happened, Dean wasn't going to abandon his family. So he camped outside the house in his car, keeping an eye on things. Then one night, a car pulled up. Mitch and Maureen were in it, but both of them had already taken their own lives. What was going on? Whatever it was, the next day, Nora received another shock. The details of her landline calls arrived. She had been threatened at night by a number in the motel, but the call had come from their home's landline. Just then, they heard voices outside. It was Pearl Winslow. She had thrown a lunch party at her place to summon Maureen and figure out what had happened to her. Nora joined the party. Maureen had already guessed why the party was held. A couple of days ago, Mitch and Maureen had gone on vacation to Florida. Their son knew about it. In their absence, he went to a nursing home in New Haven and brought back two elderly people who looked exactly like Mitch and Maureen. Then, he shot them so he could claim the insurance money. In the midst of all this, Nora mentioned the letters she had been receiving. That's when Pearl Winslow told her that 5 years ago, they had received a letter for their house too, titled The Watcher of the House. It said, "Your house is very special, standing for 99 years, and I hope you won't make any changes to it." Nora shared this with her daughter as well. 5 years ago, the Winslows received a love letter for their house titled The Watcher of the House. Reflecting on what Ellie had done to her father, she was now full of regret. Meanwhile, Dean, struggling with his situation, was wandering aimlessly when he bumped into IShowSpeed. IShowSpeed actually wanted to help. He remembered their conversation about how the girl had appeared in their bedroom. IShowSpeed checked all the camera footage from every angle of the house, but there was no trace of the girl entering the house. He showed all the footage to Nora, and she finally began to trust Dean again. Maybe that girl really was some sort of ghost? Whatever the case, before giving Dean another chance, Nora had a few questions. Was Dean the one writing the letters? After all, she had been called and threatened from their landline the night she came home from the motel. Dean confessed to writing the first letter because he wanted to scare Nora into selling the house. It was simple. They couldn't afford the house. Dean had believed that after becoming a partner in the company, the money would start flowing. Everything had failed. To make the mortgage payments, he had applied for another loan, but he was denied. In desperation, he took a loan of $2.5 million from some mafias, and now he was stuck. These people were extremely dangerous, and if he didn't pay up, it would cost him dearly. Dean had done all this to get out of the mess, but he had only written one letter. The truth was about to come out, because the DNA report on that first letter was due today. Chamberlain opened the sealed report in front of them. It turned out that the DNA didn't match anyone in their database, but it did confirm that the Watcher was a woman. They spent a long time puzzling over this, but they couldn't reach any conclusions. The next morning, Karen called with another offer for the house. Someone was offering $1.9 million, but that was way too low. They had bought the house for $3.3 million. Why sell at such a loss? Even so, Nora said she would think about it. That afternoon, Nora went to the country club to see if her ban had been lifted. There she saw Karen and Chamberlain, who were dating. Karen had never mentioned this. Nora figured out the whole scheme. She immediately called Dean. Now it made sense why Chamberlain wasn't investigating properly. They couldn't afford the house themselves, so Karen and Chamberlain had been scaring them to buy it at a lower price. Chamberlain had even recommended Theodore Birch. Maybe she was involved too. She was the one who had arranged the meeting with the previous owner, Andrew. Dean had recently seen Andrew in a TV ad. Now they understood that Andrew had been instructed by them to tell Dean that made-up story to scare him. They were going to file a case against both of them for plotting all this. Karen was furious, accusing them of outright blaming her. Anyway, that night, Ellie shared some astonishing information. While searching for information about the house's letters on Facebook, found a group. All the members of this group had attended Whitefield High School. Someone from the group had even posted a letter. The group's English teacher had given an assignment to the class: find a house they liked, write about its features, and leave the letter in the mailbox, while keeping their identity hidden. The teacher's name was Kaplan, and his address was also listed. When Nora saw his photo, she remembered he had been at the house on the day they first came to view it. Then, their contractor found something in the basement. Cold air was coming from somewhere inside. After several days, a worker finally discovered the reason. There was a tunnel. When they shone a flashlight inside, they saw someone who quickly ran away. They chased him further inside and found a room with a bed and pillow. Complete setup for someone living there. Person ran off again, and though they tried to follow him, vanished. It turned out to be John Graff, killer of his family, and Pearl Winslow was involved in his conspiracy. Dean realized that this tunnel might be used to attack other houses in the area, explaining how people were entering even when the houses were locked. The next morning, he went to Winslow's house to check if any tunnel was attached to it. To inspect the house, he would need a search warrant, but he had already had a conflict with Chamberlain. John, who was hiding and listening to their conversation, was actually controlling these troublesome siblings. They had formed a group that protested the renovation of historical buildings in their society, believing tampering with old heritage was a sin. Dean was about to leave for the office when he noticed Mr. Kaplan, the teacher, talking to Maureen. Dean lashed out at him, accusing him of having a student write scary letters about their house due to his ridiculous assignment, or perhaps he was involved in the tunnel at Maureen's house. Dean's frustration was overwhelming, and he started doubting everyone. This fear led him to have a terrifying dream that night. Living in fear wasn't why they bought the house. If there's no joy in living here, what's the point of this house? They agreed to put the house up for sale. They found a buyer willing to pay $3.5 million. However, an article about the house being haunted went viral on the internet, detailing all the ghost stories. Potential buyer backed out. Nora knew exactly who was behind this. Karen admitted she had the article published because she was humiliated that day. They took the money they had and moved to a different city, trying to escape the mess. The next morning, they saw that the house had been sold at a lower price. The new owners had started renovations. Meanwhile, the group's meeting took place. They wanted to ensure that historical buildings in the society weren't tampered with or altered. But legally, they couldn't enforce this. Roger Kaplan, who had joined their group, wanted to know how they could prevent changes to their homes. They were putting pressure on others with lies and deceit, determined not to let old cities be ruined. William was the mastermind behind all this, using the name John Graff. Nobody recognized him because he had removed his face from all photos. Later, Pearl and Maureen visited Karen's house. After a brief acquaintance, Karen shut the door on them, showing how rude she was compared to Dean's family. That night, as she was going to sleep with the house locked, she received a call on the landline that turned out to be a trick. She heard noises of a running faucet and found the tap was on, with scalding hot water burning her hands. She couldn't understand what was happening and called Chamberlain for help, but he outright refused. Karen wanted to stay alone. Her dog was killed, and she saw a shadow, which made her flee, never returning to the house. Within 24 hours, she sold the house and another family moved in. Everyone was watching them closely. So, who was behind all this? Were the historical preservationists responsible, or was iShowSpeed running his business this way? Case remains unresolved. This series is available on Netflix, and only Season 1 is out. Like this video and subscribe to our channel for upcoming films. Until then, check out the horror movie Smile by clicking here, and Blood Train by clicking here.